619-578. Okay, ThinkTech Global. Here we are on a Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m., 4 o'clock rock, and we have an update on Turkey today with our special Turkey correspondent, Russell Koehler, who joins us from his office, in the Capitol building, or in the Hart Office building, I guess, in Washington. Welcome again to the show, Russell. Welcome again to the show, Russell.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Jay.
Anyway, just for those who may have just tuned in on our shows about Turkey, we've been doing several of them since you were there as a student and an observer a couple of years ago, I guess it was already. And we continue to follow Turkey through your interpretation and your expertise. And one thing I think people need to understand is that Turkey is the divide point between the East and the West. On one side is Europe, and then there's the Bosphorus, and on the other side there's Asia. And this is more than symbolic. It's more than just a body of water in between the two parts of Istanbul. This is a real separation. And Turkey has learned to live with that since, 1922, when Ataturk sort of westernized Turkey. But in recent years, it's become much more complicated under the first president and the prime minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And there were riots a few years ago. People don't like his policies, and he seems to be reactionary in some ways. And instead of creating a togetherness in Turkey, he seems to be creating a polarization in Turkey between the East and the West, between the Muslims and the others. And then he's got this fight under the hood with the Kurds, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. So what I'm saying is Turkey is more interesting all the time. So you are more interesting, and you are more important to us all the time, Russell. We need to stay in touch with you, Russell.
Thank you. Hopefully.
Well, let's. I went on. I went on the Google, and I just hit the words news, and Turkey came out. This is one day of news. It came out with like a dozen articles of news about Turkey. Turkey is a very newsy place lately. A lot is happening in Turkey, and you have to filter out the important versus the not so important. But strikes me per our discussion before we went on the air that the big deal is Turkey's relationship with Europe, and for that matter, Turkey's relationship with Syria, with what's going on in Syria. There are so many things happen. It is really the keystone of the cap of the Middle East, and we can see so much by seeing what's going on in Turkey. So what about the migrant deal? Erdogan has been negotiating a deal. What's the status of that negotiation?
Absolutely. Well, the Turkey-EU migrant deal had to deal with the European Union wanting a mechanism, a framework by which they could limit the amount of migrants coming into the European Union. As we've seen over the last couple years, the last couple months, the migrant crisis has overwhelmed a lot of European countries, and specifically European governments. A lot of Balkan countries have shut down their borders, which has led to a huge crowding within Greece, and specifically on Lesbos, the island which most refugees and migrants do stop off at.
That's now, the way station, isn't it? That's where they all
exactly
the interim place, yeah.
Exactly. I actually had a very good friend who was volunteering, giving emergency relief aid on Lesbos, and from her and stories that she was able to tell me, it was horrifying. The experiences that these people had to go through, even up to a year before they had even landed upon European soil. Now, EU-Turkey migrant deal is in real jeopardy right now, and particularly that's because the current Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as you correctly pronounced, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, he has a particular problem with a clause within the deal that the EU and Turkey has agreed upon, which were 72 measures, framework agreements that they would agree to that Turkey would adopt to be qualified for visa-free travel for Turkish citizens within the EU. They'd be part of the Schengen area. But unfortunately for the European Union and unfortunately for President Erdogan, in that deal was a specific clause targeting Turkey's very ambiguous and very problematic, in my opinion, terrorism law. The Turks, in their code of law, define terrorism as a means of any party or entity that threatens the unity of the state. Now there is extra language in there, but more or less that's what a terrorist entity is, and that's very ambiguous. There's no specificity there. Yeah. What ends up happening is the Turkish president, over the course of his tenure of 10, 12 years, has used this very ambiguous identification of terrorists and terrorism to really crack down on dissidents, to repress press and media freedoms, and to really criticize the West in terms of being hypocritical, and in that, he states that Turkey's fighting two wars: one against the PKK, the Turkish terrorist organization, and ISIS, which is continually bombed Istanbul and Ankara. But
would you say that's true? Is Turkey fighting two wars against those two organizations?
I would certainly say they're fighting two wars. Now, whether or not those two specific wars were not necessarily caused, but perpetuated by the Turkish government and their problematic policies of discrimination, exclusionism, authoritarianism, and supporting radical jihadist elements in Syria, that's another story. I certainly think that the Turkish government has not done itself any favors when it comes to mending the ties between the Turkish government and the Kurdish community that is very sympathetic to the PKK in the southeast of Turkey.
Is there any downside for him to mend those ties? Seems to me that it's an unnecessary argument that he's creating. He doesn't have to have an argument with the Kurds, and yet he seems to be arguing with them and attacking them every time he gets a chance. Why does he do that? Is there a benefit to him?
And unfortunately, because of the political conditions within the country, he actually does have a political advantage when it comes to this very visceral, very violent language towards the Kurdish communities, towards the PKK, towards people who have criticized the Turkish government's military operations against the PKK in eastern and southern Turkey. And the way he's able to spin this is, over the past, we had this last election in November 2015, where the AKP party, the Justice and Development Party, Erdogan's particular political party, which he founded, won over 49% of the vote. And in parliamentary democracy, that is huge.
That's pretty good, yeah.
Exactly. And in order to garner that much, coming off of the rather poor results in the previous June elections, where they were only able to manage around 40%, actually less than 40% of the vote, is they utilized nationalist voters within Turkey. And nationalist voters within Turkey are very anti-PKK. They are against any and all form of integration of Kurdish cultural and social rights.
Where does that come from? Why are they against that? Why is there this argument? Wouldn't it be better for the country in general if they buried the hatchet?
Absolutely. In my personal opinion, Turkey has always been a pluralist country. It's been a multi-ethnic country, a multi-religious country, a multicultural country. But unfortunately, even in the United States of America, there are elements that do call upon their lesser angels and
how nice of you to put it that way.
Exactly. And do fear other people. They fear foreigners, fear outsiders, fear change. And unfortunately, this comes out of the real Turkism of Ataturk in 1923. Of course, this is not what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, had in mind, but unfortunately, it has grown out of that, in which have really taken a hold of and are supportive of the AKP and specifically of President Erdogan.
Yeah, and well, he's been exacerbating things, hasn't he? He's been creating polarizations for several years. And frankly, he seems to be very strong, but he also seems to be very negative in the way he leads the country, especially at a time when the country is in crisis from both ends.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, for me, Erdogan is looking at his short-term political advantages. In terms of a strategic objective, President Erdogan wants to remain in power until at least 2023. And the reason for that is 2023 is the centennial anniversary of the Turkish Republic. And given President Erdogan's rather polarizing agenda, rather revolutionary agenda, as we could probably say, he wants to create, by the centennial anniversary, a new identity of Turkey, a more conservative identity of Turkey, and a Turkey that is able to formulate its own foreign policy and its own direction into the next century. And unfortunately, in order to accomplish those long-term objectives, he needs to very ruthlessly accomplish short-term political objectives by consolidating certain political parties, as well as, of course, as we've seen, jailing and imprisoning dozens of journalists.
Yeah, well, there was a story about that in the Times report that I saw, where he's imprisoned 2 journalists for somehow making statements which were not in the interests of the state. It was, again, as you said, very vague, very ambiguous charge that was made against them. But the fact is they both got 5 years. That's pretty heavy on a journalist who reports what he sees are the facts. So, I mean, that's conservative, I would say. That's clamping down on liberal, I would say. Is he making traction doing that? And it sounds like it comes from him. It's not somebody else. It's Erdogan doing that. Is he making traction? Do people like that? What is the sense in the streets about putting journalists in jail?
Well, I would certainly have the opinion that most Turks on the street, would want to have a voice within the political dialogue and be able to listen to informed criticism or informed media and press that is either supportive or against the Turkish government. The unfortunate thing is, given since probably 2006, 2007, when this downward trend of authoritarianism started
under Erdogan,
under then former Prime Minister Erdogan and now President Erdogan. Unfortunately, Turks have begun to adjust their lives accordingly to the new norm within Turkey. Mm-hmm. And that's not only sad, but that's dangerous, given that if they are willing to adjust to this new Turkey, it's no wonder why the trend has continued. And these 2 journalists, I believe Can Dündar and Erdem Gül, they're both part of the same media organization, Today's Zaman, which is one of the largest opposition media agencies within Turkey. They were tried and convicted for the crime of revealing state secrets. And were accused of treason, terrorism, propaganda, terrorism propaganda support, and their crime through all that. What they did was Turkey had been supporting for a long time, and it's come out in the media, and I believe most people know now that during the Syrian civil war, the Turks were supplying Sunni jihadist rebels against the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And these journalists were were given information by specific commanders that a load of trucks, covered trucks with supplies, had actually been stopped on the border. And this was actually the Turkish intelligence service that was actually transporting supplies and arms to these Syrian rebels. And so this information, journalists and the journalists published this information, did their due diligence, and published information on a war which was being conducted covertly. And granted, as I say that now, it sounds almost, they had just revealed a covert operation sanctioned by the state, when we know that when you look at the groups that Turkey has supported within Syria during that time, well, there's actually no wonder why Turkey's dealing with the sort of the terrorism from ISIS that we see now.
Yeah, if that happened in the U.S., they'd probably get a Pulitzer.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And actually, when I saw that article, that's exactly what I thought. I thought to myself, these men don't deserve 5 years. They deserve, a Pulitzer Prize. This is unbelievable. And furthermore to that, which was not reported in the New York Times, was the commanders of those specific units that had actually stopped and halted those trucks going into Syria, again, doing their due diligence, protecting the Turkish border, were removed from office and are being court-martialed.
Well, is tightening everything up. I suppose in the nature of protecting the state's position against ISIS and what's going on in Syria. But it sounds like he's clamping down much too hard. And in the process, he's got to be losing support in Europe. Because in Europe, they do have the First Amendment. I mean, called something else. But, I mean, freedom of the press is really important in Western Europe. And the people in Europe must not be sympathetic at all to these journalists going to jail.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Freedom House, the international observer of press and media freedoms, has actually labeled Turkey not free.
Yeah.
This is a development that has with former then Prime Minister Erdogan, and now President Erdogan's problematic reign within the country.
Yeah.
Turkey has one of, if not the worst record of press and media repression in the world today. To say that and acknowledge that Turkey is a NATO member, a traditional U.S. ally, a EU candidate country.
This isn't going to help them. This is not going to help Turkey get into the EU.
Absolutely.
Although
and
that may not be as popular as it used to be anyway.
Exactly. And it's certainly not going to help the United States become more and more comfortable with the idea of a President Erdogan remaining in power for the long-term future.
Yeah.
And so, given these policies, given his problematic agenda, the only thing I see within Turkey going forward is a further decline into further autocracy.
Yeah. Well, and that goes to the question of his prime minister. I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between the president and the prime minister? Erdogan was all-powerful as the prime minister, and then he became the president. Then he was all-powerful and is all-powerful as the president. What's the difference?
Well, Turkey has a very interesting system of government, as we've come to all find out. The prime minister, as you rightly pointed out, has all political power within Turkey. It's the head of the party. It's the head of parliament. It is he or she is the head of the legislative making body. The president of Turkey is head of the bureaucracy, within Turkey. But more so, it's more of a symbolic position, more of a position symbolizing unity. That's supposed to be above the fray of politics, of rhetoric, of political dialogue. And over the course of these last couple years, we've seen an erosion of those dividing lines. Prime Minister Erdogan quickly consolidated legislative making power, as well as continued press and media repression throughout the country, throughout his time, destroying his enemies within the military, as well as continually instilling loyalists within the judiciary, as well as within parliament. He was able to get enough support within parliament to make a change to the constitution, for the first time having the Turkish president be elected direct popular vote. Now, a lot of people in this country would certainly like that, but in a country like Turkey, a direct popular vote is very dangerous. And the reason for that is a President Erdogan, which is so effectively consolidated press and media onto one side, mainly appointing loyalists to manage and head those media organizations, as well as stifled any and all resistance, as well as has the ability to really be a monopoly over the face of Turkey, over the identity of Turkey, really has consolidated all the voter base, at least the majority. And so when he ran for election in 2014, he won very handily.
Interesting.
And will continue to do so.
Interesting.
Currently, the Turkish president now might as well be what the American president is now. And the prime minister might as well be in a position that is to fulfill the president's political agenda.
Like the vice president.
Exactly. And President Erdogan has, for the first time, and has violated the Turkish constitution time and time again, has involved political fray, has supported Turkish politicians within their elections, which again is against the Turkish constitution, against Turkish law, and has continually pressured the legislative making body, as well as other political parties, specifically the pro-Kurdish interest party, on getting specific things through.
Well, let's take a short break, Russell. And when we come back, I'd like to hear about his prime minister switch that he accomplished only a week or two ago. That's very interesting, and all it's on the same issues you've been describing. That's Russell Koehler. He's our expert on Turkey. He joins us from Washington by Skype, and thank you for staying up late, Russell. We're going to take a short break. Take a nap. We'll be right back.
Aloha, everybody. My name is Mark Shklov. I'd like you to join me for my program, Law Across the Sea, on ThinkTechHawaii.com. Aloha.
Aloha, this is Maria Mera, and I'm here to invite you to my bilingual show, Viva Hawaii, on ThinkTech Hawaii, every other Monday at 3 p.m. We're here to inform, motivate, and entertain you. Join us. Hola, soy María Mera y estoy aquí para invitaros a mi show bilingüe Viva Hawaii en ThinkTech Hawaii cada 2 lunes a las 3 de la tarde. Estamos aquí para informaros, motivaros y entreteneros. Apuntaros.
Aloha! Hello, my name is Patrick Bratton. I'm host at Global Connections here at ThinkTech Hawaii. We broadcast live every Thursday at 1 p.m. We bring Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii, talking about international events and various things of interest to the audience. Please join me. I look forward to talking with you and having you get to meet some of my guests. Aloha.
Back, we're live. We're here with Russell Koehler. He's our expert on Turkey, and Turkey is the capstone, as they say, of the Middle East. The blending, the meeting of East and West, I'm not so sure it's blending anymore. You know, there used to be more, what did you call it before? Multi-element, you know, society in Turkey, and it's actually becoming more polarized now under Erdogan, who has not been he has not been faithful to Ataturk's idea of a republic. And, you know, from what you described before the break, it sounds like he's systematically undoing it, you know, the beauty of Ataturk's republic, which is really a big loss to Turkey, because Turkey was a Western country in many ways. It was a universal country, really the bridge between East and West. So let's talk about Banali. I don't remember his last name, but Banali is now what? The prime minister. And the reason Banali is the prime minister is that somehow the previous prime minister fell out with Erdogan. Erdogan made him disappear, and now Banali's the prime. How did that happen? Why did it happen? What does it mean?
Absolutely. And before I get to that point, I do have to acknowledge that even with Ataturk's Turkish Republic, there were specific issues with that country. I think all Turks would acknowledge that there were problems with the country before the AKP and Erdogan, as there are current problems with Erdogan currently. Of course, you and I think agree upon the fact that it's much worse now. Now, going back to your question with the new Prime Minister, Banali Yildirim, it's a mouthful, by the way. His election is anything but, if I can be quite frank. The former Prime Minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, which was a politician that, while weak and in the shadow of President Erdogan throughout his term, was fairly liked throughout the world. He was a former Turkish professor who had served as the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, and had risen to the role of Prime Minister, having served under then Prime Minister Erdogan. This occurrence, this falling out between the former Prime Minister and President Erdogan, occurred based on very, very deep political disagreements. On the surface, you would not have been able to really see anything, but researchers, analysts within Turkey have begun to dig up some of the real fissures between the two men. And I'll briefly highlight three very important ones, and we've mentioned some of them earlier. First, former Prime Minister Davutoglu was open to coming to the table with the PKK. President Erdogan, of course, has decided upon not only continuing the war, but escalating the war, has decided that this war will not be over until all rifles are silent. And what he means by that is this war isn't over until all PKK fighters are annihilated. And the former prime minister was very much against that. Number two is the EU-Turkey migrant deal. The prime minister was actually the architect of this migrant crisis deal. He was the chief negotiator with the other heads of European states and had actually agreed upon moderating Turkey's very problematic terrorism laws. Again, President Erdogan, as we've seen, has very much stalled and put into jeopardy that deal based upon that specific clause, terrorism laws. Davutoglu was a real moderating force to Erdogan. Erdogan is brash. He's very visceral, very aggressive. Whereas Davutoglu was very academic, very intellectual, and really believed in the unity of his specific position. Now, the third disagreement, and we can sort of go on from this, I believe, is because it's our next subject, is Prime Minister Davutoglu was none too pleased about the constitutional change that President Erdogan wanted with regards to changing the Turkish system of government.
And to exclude the Kurds.
Exactly. Prime Minister Davutoglu did not agree with the presidential system. He did not want an executive presidency within Turkey. He very much believed in parliamentary democracy because it inherently forces the country to be open to a wide range of ideas. And so, given those very deep disagreements, and those are the three main ones, I could go over, I believe there's 27 of them in this one journalist in Turkey had highlighted. But
he's not in jail yet, eh?
No, he's not. I told my friends immediately when I saw that, he better get over here as fast as he can. But fortunately, he's a very good politician and has said that his friendship with Erdogan will be until his last breath, etc., etc. And so, the current Prime Minister, Banali Yildirim, had actually served as President Erdogan's transportation minister for a very long period of time, and actually had been one of the founding members of the AKP party in 2001. And so he had been not only a political associate of President Erdogan for a long period of time, but has been labeled a loyalist of President Erdogan.
Which means he'll do whatever Erdogan wants.
Exactly. Upon his, and I will use quotes here, his election within the AKP Congress, they had the party, the Justice and Development Party, actually elected him to be their prime minister. Mind you, there was no opponent. Upon his victory, he had stated that, Mr. President, I believe, I want you to know that your passion will be our passion, your path will be our path, your cause will be our cause.
Oh.
And what he meant by that was the most significant policy in which his government will approach is the constitutional change to a presidential system. Again, the prime minister in Turkey has now become a position in which fulfills the political agenda of the Turkish president.
Okay, that's one thing, and then the constitution was changed to effectively exclude Kurds from the legislature, the parliament. And then, gee whiz, the terrorism law puts greater power in Erdogan's hands. And it's, the whole thing is moving right, becoming more conservative, more repressive, more like a totalitarian state. And I suppose that's consistent with some of the political moves in Europe these days to react against the migrants and the terrorism. But gee whiz, and this is the big question about discussion, I think. Is this good for Turkey? Aside from, I'll ask you also, is it good for Turkey's relationship outside of Turkey? But is it good for Turkey? Can Turkey be stable this way? Will people go along with this? And I traveled to Turkey, 3 years ago, at the time of those riots in the square, the Taksim Square, was it, in Istanbul? And I thought the people in Turkey were, like Western people, like kids, like Americans even. And it strikes me now that this is very repressive, must be of great concern to a lot of people in Turkey. Can Turkey remain stable with these very profound political changes?
I don't believe so. And I will come right out and say it. I don't believe we will see a more stable Turkey than we have seen before. You're right to point out the legislative amendment that was the bill that was passed on destroying the political immunities of Kurdish lawmakers, of parliamentarians within the Turkish parliament. And this sort of legislation actually hasn't happened within Turkey since the early 90s. And I want everybody to really acknowledge here how serious this is. Destroying the political immunities of parliamentarians within Turkey opens lawmakers up to be prosecuted against.
By Erdogan, giving him
Erdogan
greater power to knock off the opposition in the parliament.
Exactly. And it would be like our DOJ, our Department of Justice, opening up investigations on all, let's say, Republican congressmen and women, and in effect, making their term in office null and void. in effect making them illegitimate from serving office, sweeping them clear, having another set of elections, and voting in another round of nationalists or conservative lawmakers. And so it's what will happen as a result of this is a further retrenchment of the Kurdish community, which is already fighting the Turkish government, and a further disillusionment of Kurdish youth, of Kurdish intellectuals, of Kurdish lawmakers.
And they're all over the country, right? I mean,
exactly.
the Kurds are integrated in the society there. It's not as if they're in one place only.
Absolutely, and I mean, I don't think the Turkish government fully appreciates the fact that the largest Kurdish population in Turkey is in Istanbul. It's not in the southeast, in Diyarbakir or Mersin or or in other cities, Nusaybin. It's in Istanbul, and if you continue to erode the rights, the constitutional rights of an enormous amount of people within your country that already has a radical revolutionary organization saying they are fighting for it. I don't particularly believe that is the case. But if you have those elements and you have this sort of repression, I personally cannot see a stable Turkey going forward. And this is, putting the role of ISIS and the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis off to one side.
Yes.
This is, we're just talking about the Kurdish community here.
Inside Turkey, yeah.
Exactly, within Turkey.
Yeah, but it gets more complicated because Turkey has got, issues on both sides. It's got this failed negotiation on the migrants on the European side. It's what I consider its failed candidacy for the EU on the European side. And it's got violence, horrible violence in Syria. And it's got people from Syria coming in and doing violence in Turkey, a number of terror attacks. So my next question to you, Russell, should you decide to answer,
I will.
is what does this destabilization mean for Turkey vis-a-vis its relationships outside? What does it mean, in terms of, the whole migrant issue and its relationship with Europe on the one side, and what does it mean for the war, which still goes on in Syria on the other side? If Turkey collapses, if Turkey goes unstable, if Turkey is unable to execute diplomacy or really anything else, what happens?
Yeah, I've had a chance to speak about this issue with coworkers within the office, and the conclusion that we sort of get to is an unstable Turkey is never a positive in any way, shape, or form. Whether that goes into American foreign policy, solving or providing a solution to the Syrian civil war, providing a constructive solution on the Kurdish issues within the region, whether that is creating a constructive solutions on dealing with the refugee crisis, and in effect dealing with violent extremism at large. An unstable Turkey undermines all of that. We have the largest refugee population in modern history within Turkey currently, upwards in 2.6 million people. We have, like you said, we've had terrorist attacks within Turkey, conducted by ISIS members and other terrorist organizations, and further radicalism within Turkey. And we do have a civil war on the border. And so an unstable Turkey going forward destabilizes everything.
Yeah.
How far that destabilizing effect spreads, I can't be sure.
No, it's hard to say. It's hard to say what happens. But you know, as this news leaks, I mean, you know, I shouldn't say leaks, but as this news gets out of Turkey and gets into, you know, dozens of articles any given day in the New York Times, just Google it and you'll see the country, the administration, the regime in the country loses credibility. And you don't know where that goes. You don't know where that goes in terms of how other nations react. I mean, for example, one of the articles that I picked up was an article about Kenya. You say, what? Kenya? What does that got to do with Turkey? Well, Kenya has expressed a concern that Turkey is getting money for the refugees within its borders, and Kenya's not, because Kenya has migrant problems too. And it wants to be treated the same way as Turkey. So, and somehow that, to me, that relates to the credibility of Turkey. Turkey is no longer the strong capstone of the Middle East and that part of Africa. Turkey has turned into something else. And I think now people can take whacks at Turkey. They can, you know, they can treat it with less respect, if you will. Not only on the battlefield, not only in, you know, in among those young people there in Istanbul, but in world diplomacy, in the way the world sees Turkey. And I think this is we're observing a really interesting phenomenon right now. And as you say, it's not a good one on any level.
Absolutely. And, you know, I really believe Turkey is at a crisis point right now. And currently the regime relies upon, I mean, in effect, chaos to survive. This is a government that relies upon infighting, crises on its border, crises within the country in order to further consolidate itself, whether that be trying to get more concessions out of the EU, given the fact that, you know, if I'm Turkey, I can say to the EU, well, you know, we have 2.6 million people here. You wouldn't like it if, you know, we somewhat turned our, you know, looked away and let these people through into your borders, would you? So you have that effect, as well as within the Syrian civil war, as it pertains to us, you have the Turks pressuring us based upon our support of the PYG Kurds within Syria.
Yeah.
And so it's really come to a point within Turkey where they have to decide what kind of state that they want to be going forward.
And we in the United States, we have to decide how this changes our foreign policy in the region. Gosh, it's complicated. But the decline of Turkey, which we are observing, you know, means we have to change our view of Turkey. We have to change how we deal with Turkey. I mean, how do you see that going forward? How will U.S. policy, and of course we can't anticipate exactly what the next president's going to do anyway, but how do you see this affecting relations between the U.S. and Turkey?
I think relations with Turkey will become more of a necessity rather than a preference. I think that President Erdogan's recent policies and continual authoritarian trend has created a real chilling effect with regards to Turkish and American relations. We still heavily cooperate on a number of issues, but I think that is reluctantly cooperating on a number of issues. One of the reasons why we pursue consistent cooperation with the Syrian Kurds in the Syrian civil war and combating ISIS is because the Turks have not done enough, according to administration officials, to combat ISIS themselves. Have not done enough previously and have not pledged enough going forward on combating our currently our most dangerous enemy.
And the stakes for them are higher because it's happening right there. And we're out of time, Russell. I'm sorry to tell you, I really enjoy these conversations. There'll be more news in the New York Times and elsewhere, and we will check it out, and we will talk to you again in a few weeks. I hope that's okay. We want to stay informed on this, whether people realize it in Hawaii or elsewhere. This is a very important topic. It's a very important country. It's a very important relationship. Thank you so much, Russell.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to talk anytime.
Russell Koehler, our expert on Turkey and that area of the world. Aloha. We'll talk to you again soon.